fractious feud between the SACP and the ANC. Could this be a split in the Tripartite alliance? Or is it just another storm in a teacup? Let's find out. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. If you're new around here, I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and on this channel, we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. And in this episode, interviews and analysis are intersecting because it turns out that one of our very own interviews is the talk of the political town in South Africa. You may have seen that I interviewed the SACP's General Secretary, Mapaila, last week. That interview's got more than 120,000 views now. Shout out to you. But it has caused shockwaves in the alliance and shockwaves for the GNU. And so I am actually going to take a step back and analyze the outcome of my interview with Mapaila, because he said that the ANC was selling out by joining forces with the DA. He said that the SACP was not consulted with this GNU alliance. And there were also intimations of, if not a split, then definitely tensions within the Tripartite alliance. So in this episode, I'm going to look at all of those three things. Well. South African politics never disappoints, and the drama continues. So let's start off with the first point, which is about this question of whether the ANC has sold out by going into the GNU. Now, so many people sent me messages and calls after this interview to say, at last, someone has spoken out and said how I feel. Now, I know that not all South Africans feel that way about the GNU. It's not a GNU, firstly, it's a coalition government. But I, for one, have mixed feelings. But the media landscape has tended to praise this coalition as if it can do no wrong. And there have been very few critical voices. So when Mapaila came out with a stinging rebuke of the GNU, it became clear that he was speaking for many people who are in some ways on the margins of the mainstream narrative about this coalition government. But let's delve into what he said to try and make sense of whether it was coherent or not. And after the interview, funny story, when I do interviews, obviously I'm listening intently, but when I go back to the interview, I'm like, whoa, I can't believe he said that. So when I went back to the interview and I saw the fallout, there were a number of things that I picked up. Firstly, I think this is a key moment when he describes what he thinks is this sellout moment. And listen carefully, we're going to analyze what he said just after this.
It's a gross error. Serious mistake. Our leaders, the political elite, committed this criminality of joining forces with the DA. It's a political choice. I think they will be judged harshly by history, and I call on history to judge them badly for the betrayal of our people. This is a betrayal, Sizwe. It cannot be entertained in any political decorations. Cannot be laced in any other form. It's a sellout of the people's aspiration.
So that was what Mapaila said about the ANC selling out, and I was shocked by just how strong and harsh his words were, calling it a sellout, saying that history would judge those who created this deal harshly. Now, much to my surprise, soon after this interview, ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula came out swinging on Twitter, came out swinging on a press briefing, came out swinging in an interview with ENCA. I want you to have a look at his response to Mapaila, and then we'll decode this war of words between alliance partners. Have a look at what he said in an interview with Heidi Jokos.
Well, those statements are unfortunate. The Communist Party is a party that believes in political engagement, not in rhetoric, phrase-mongering, and putting labels on issues. GNUs in their very nature and coalitions are constituted worldwide by not ideologically aligned political parties. Sometimes it is the far right and the center left that come together, or all round. So South Africa is not a unique position. And for saying that when you work in the GNU that is led by the ANC, we have sold out, he's got to look at the content, including the statement of intent and what we seek to do in that GNU, and then begin to say this is a sellout position. So what Comrade Soli is arguing, he knows that there is a platform to engage us, to talk to us, rather than defining the ANC as a big faction and that our president is simply a president who leads a faction of neoliberal people and all of that. I think that is an insult to an ally. It's a matter that if he believes in that as solely or as a communist party, they can engage with the ANC. So we are not going to engage in talking past each other. We've got an Alliance Political Council coming. We'll engage there. We invited the party at the Lekotla of the ANC. We provided a platform. He did not come. Comrade Blade represented, and he spoke very well about the issues. COSATU was there, was frank in that platform. They were critical of the GNU that involves the DA. It's acceptable. We engaged in a political discussion, including politically, what do we characterize this moment as the African National Congress.
And notice, by the way, that I said in an ENCA interview with Heidi Jokos, these journalists be taking my interviews, treating it as news, and they don't even have the justice to say in an interview with Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh on SMWX, please, news houses, kindly cite your sources as I do to you, and don't act like you don't know SMWX. I saw a News 24 article. It was like, in a podcast, Mapaila said, "What's a podcast, News 24? When I use your material, I cite you. Kindly cite me too when you base your stories off my interviews." Anyway, back to the matter at hand. So this interview has obviously created this big feud. A couple of things that I want to pull out. First, and I just want to say this, we have invited Fikile Mbalula onto this channel more times than I can count. He continues not to want to come, and that's his choice. I think many politicians haven't figured out how big digital platforms are yet, and I can guarantee that if he were to come on the channel, it would get more views than if he went on any other news channel. But hey, I don't force anyone to come. I invite. So once again, I invite Fikile Mbalula to come and give his side of the story. I'll give him the same platform which I gave Mapaila. Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. But there were 2 things that stood out for me. The first was that Mapaila was making an argument here that we need to pull apart. The first is that the ANC had other political choices other than this so-called GNU option. And I think that's a valid point. The ANC has painted this as if they only had one choice and they were pushed into a corner because either the EFF and MK party were unreasonable or they had no other political options. But the fact of the matter is that the ANC does have to take responsibility, and that could be good or bad depending on how well this coalition goes. The ANC will have to accept that it took a political choice which was one out of many. I think that's true, and I think Mapaila's right about that. The ANC could have become a minority government. The ANC could have gone into a coalition with just say 3 parties. It could have gone into coalition with the DA and the IFP. There was no reason to create this 8-party situation or 11 or 10-party situation. It could have gone into coalition with the EFF and the IFP. There were various options. Now, Mbalula has moved to say, yeah, but you wanted us to go into a coalition with the MK party, and the ANC has started this narrative that the MK party is the party of state capture. Everyone who committed corruption has now gone to the MK party, and so the ANC wouldn't go with the MK because that would signify a move to corruption. Hold on, ANC. Don't be so quick to act like those people were not your members at the time of corruption, at the time of state capture. So you can't suddenly distance yourself just because those people have broken away. And by the way, not everyone who's left the ANC has corruption allegations over them, and not everyone who is still in the ANC does not have corruption allegations over them. So not so fast, ANC. You're not going to be able to divert attention from your corruption and your party's governance over the last 30 years by simply deflecting to MK party. But the whole point is that the ANC's other options were not simply MK party. There were an array of options between this ANC-DA plus partnership and various other partnerships. So that's the first thing, and I think Mapaila is dead right on that. Now, the second thing is when I look at Mbalula's response, there are two dimensions to it. The first is that he says, well, these kind of coalition arrangements are common across the world. And that's true too, but that's besides the point. It's not relevant to whether the option that was chosen was the appropriate and the right option. So it's one thing to say, yes, many other countries have done similar things. By the way, I don't think this coalition resembles the GNUs in other countries, and I've spoken about that in a whole lot of other interviews, so check those out, and a whole lot of other videos, which is why I don't think this can be characterized as a GNU. But just because other countries have had coalition governments doesn't mean that this particular coalition choice was the right one. So I don't think he engaged directly with Mapaila's argument there. However, what he did say, which was interesting to me, is that we are going to be engaging the SACP, and we are keen to avoid a war of words, in other words. Now, I mean, Mbalula himself did go quite far on Twitter and really released like 6 or 7 a stream of tweets suggesting that what Mapaila said on this platform was inappropriate. But it's true, he didn't label him or call him any names, although Mapaila also didn't mention any names. So he was very strong in his criticism, Mapaila, but I'm not convinced that he was attacking people because he didn't like those people. He was making a strong political argument, which Mbalula also seems to accept, to his credit. And here's the thing that I don't think anyone is noticing about this feud. The SACP has not walked away from their comments. They have not stood down and accepted defeat. And that, although it hasn't been said in all of this, is fascinating to me. Because it would be quite easy in this climate of media attacks, both on Mbalula and Mapaila, for one of them to say, hey, look, I apologize, what I said was wrong, and I want to come back into the fold. We'll deal with this behind closed doors. The ANC has said we'll deal with it behind closed doors, basically. But the SACP hasn't said that. And after my interview, Mapaila was interviewed again very briefly on ENCA, and he basically said, I stand by what I said. Now that is fascinating to me because it tells you something that's quite important in South African politics, and it's easy to not be able to distinguish between the signal, i.e. things that matter, and the noise, just the clamor that's going on around it. I think that signals a very serious disagreement at the heart of the Tripartite alliance between the SACP on the one hand and the ANC on the other. And I'm not convinced that they will be able to reconcile those differences without some fundamental change happening. Now, later in this video, I'll talk about what the implications of that may be. Would the SACP split? Would it not? And what would it mean for the ANC? But I think what we have here in a nutshell, and to underline the kicker, is that the SACP effectively stands by what it said. Yes, Nehau came out and an ANC, if anyone has apologized, it's actually an ANC leader, Bheki Mtolo in KZN, who said all kinds of things about Nehau. Nehau is a union within COSATU. COSATU is part of the Tripartite Alliance. It's the ANC, SACP, and COSATU. So there have been feuds between COSATU unions and the ANC. Nehau convened what's called a political school, which is basically when they bring their members together and they invite lots of different perspectives. And there, Mapaila as well, launched a scathing attack on this GNU cooperation arrangement. So it's clear to me that at the very least, the SACP is quite strong on their stance, or at least there is a faction within the SACP, probably a majority faction, if the General Secretary is speaking so publicly about this, that disagrees with this coalition and is not backing down. And there is at least a component of COSATU which feels the same way. So until I see anyone from any of those two bodies publicly saying, look, we accept we were wrong and we are not going to discuss this in public anymore. We're sorry about what we said to the ANC and we'll deal with this in alliance structures. Then I'm going to continue to believe that there is a serious disagreement and dispute here, which I think is fascinating because it's maybe one of the first times we've seen a fracture in any of the forces that are part of this coalition government. Now, the second aspect of what I want to turn attention to is Mapaila's characterization of this coalition and his explicit statement that this is not a government of national unity, which I think is fascinating because we have heard this before, but he is yet another voice who refuses to characterize this as a government of national unity. Now, have a look at this clip where Mapaila says this in our interview.
Now, what we see today is the bringing back of racism through the back door, through the collaboration of this deal. The deal that is called Government of National Unity is not Government of National Unity. This is just the ANC-DA deal. It's as simple as that. And the DA, and that's why in one of my public address, when I was addressing our 103 anniversary of the Communist Party, I thanked Ms. Helen Zille for telling the truth. Because she has been, we learned more from what she was saying than what our own comrades were telling us.
Cool. So a few things to pick out here. Mapaila, as I mentioned, is not the first person to say this. None other than Helen Zille, one of the most instrumental leaders on the DA side, had this to say: this, of course, is not a government of national unity, because a government of national unity brings all the parties together and will have had to include the EFF and the MK party, which it did not, but gave the President Ramaphosa, a fig leaf to bring in smaller parties and say, quote, I am not in a coalition with the DA. So Zille has gone on public record to say this is not a GNU, this is just a way to obscure or to dress up the fact that the ANC and the DA got together and they added a bunch of smaller parties to confuse people into what this relationship really is. Now, not only Helen Zille said this, but Premier of the Western Cape on the DA side, Alan Winde, backed these statements, effectively saying that he agrees it's also not a GNU. But on the ANC side, people have remained firm that this is a government of national unity. And it's clear that the ANC wants to paint this as a government of national unity to deflect from the fact that there is a core part of this and an indispensable part of this is effectively an ANC-DA alliance. So Mapaila is really the first person to break ranks and say that no matter what the ANC may want to characterize this as, this is not a GNU. And that's very inconvenient for the ANC because on the one hand, they're presenting one message and then one of their alliance partners comes out and says, no, it's just not true. So that's quite important. And of course, it drew the ire of Fikile Mbalula again. Now I want to go to his press conference, and this is what he had to say on the matter.
It's not permanent. It can change at some point and become something else. But at the end of the day, we're not locking ourselves into a GNU permanently. That GNU will change over time. And that's what the ANC will be working on.
Now again, there's a lot of interesting material in Mbalula's response here. Because what he's putting across, and this is the first time we've heard this, is that the ANC doesn't see this as a permanent relationship. Now, the government of national unity, according to him, is something that is going to change and it's going to evolve. So I'm like, whoa. Okay, well, a number of questions emerge in my mind, and I hope I can put them to Mr. Mbalula one of these days. How will it evolve? And I'm genuinely interested to know this. Like, how would it evolve and how do you see it evolving? Would you see it evolving where parties break away? Would you see it evolving where you bring more parties in? Would it be some combination of the two? And which parties would come in and which parties would break away? So I'm fascinated that the ANC has already come out and said, hey, look, this arrangement is temporary. Now, I mean, obviously, it's always going to be temporary to the extent that there are new elections that can create a new coalition in 2029. But this gives the impression that this is even more temporary than a 5-year arrangement, that anything can happen at any given time. And that seems to me to be creating a window to his alliance partners to say, hey, look, if you come inside the tent and you stop barking from the outside, we can work towards reconfiguring this coalition in a way that is more amenable. Now, exactly what that means, I'm not sure, but the ANC's preparedness for flexibility raises my eyebrows for sure. Also, exactly how and where the evolution would come is a key question that we need to figure out. And I wonder what partners in the coalition think about that. Do they see this as a more permanent relationship, or are they also starting to wonder, well, how is it going to evolve and how would the ANC change? And what would the implications for us be if the coalition did evolve? What I will say is that Mbalula is an interesting political strategist because he subscribes to the view, put the fire out early, quickly, and change the narrative. And I think he did quite well to do that after the Mapaila interview, to the extent that he saw the interview, he saw the backlash that it caused, and immediately went on the offensive, changing the narrative, criticizing Mapaila, press conference, interview, big media presence, bringing Nehau members in and getting this, amicable situation to really present this idea that all is okay in the alliance. And also, I was quite surprised by his temperament and his temperance in saying, look, we're not going to criticize the SACP in public, because they could easily have done that. But we'd rather do it behind closed doors. Now, the ANC Youth League president, Colin Malachi, did come out today. And he made an important point as I move on to the third part of this interview, which is about whether there could actually be a split in the alliance. Now, Malachi said, well, if the SACP, and I think there's actually some validity to this criticism, if the SACP feels this strongly about the coalition, then will they remove their deployees who are in this so-called sellout government of national unity? Because we must remember, Bladen Zimande, who's the chairperson of the South African Communist Party, is still a Minister of Science and Technology, and has been a minister for a long time. Now, two things could be possible here. Either Nzimande disagrees with the line that Mapaila has taken, and that's cool, because many parties have internal disagreements, in which case Mapaila is not presenting a unified position of the SACP, even if it may be a majority position. Then you've got people like Buti Manamela, you've got people like David Masondo, who are also key members of cabinet or have been key members in the government. And so the question is, how can SACP members on the one hand enjoy the perks and the power and the privilege of being in government, but on the other hand be members of a party that calls that government a sellout? Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel, so why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. And that's the point that Colin Malachi was making, to say, well, if the SACP feels this strongly, then we look forward to the day when their deployees, he calls them, leave. And he actually said that the government of national unity is a government which includes the SACP as a party and includes COSATU as a union, so or as a trade union federation. So that's how the ANC sees it. Now, I do think that this is where the SACP argument is quite weak, because for all the bluster, maybe that's too strong a word, but for all the criticism of the government of national unity, which does go against a lot of ANC ideology, it can't be denied, the SACP will ultimately, if it is truly to be credible, it will have to put its money where its mouth is, as it were. And it will have to, over time, if these differences are irreconcilable, actually take decisions which prove its statements, rather than merely shouting from the outside but remaining inside the government. And I do think there is something to that criticism. Some people asked me, why didn't I ask Solly Mapaila, will you leave the alliance? Well, I kind of did. I spoke about the dynamics within the alliance and whether they would break away and maybe form new alliances. But I want to also, and this is just something for the viewers and the community of SMWX, an interview is, firstly, it's not as easy as it looks. But secondly, I have a very particular interview style, which I've articulated before. I try to get my guests to feel comfortable so that they can articulate things that they have never articulated before. Now, the drawback of that is that I don't go on the aggressive front foot often. So I won't be like, yeah, but how come this and how come that? And but you said this and you said that. Maybe sometimes that's necessary, but my interview style is not to trap my guest and try to make them look silly. It's to sit back and have a conversation among equals. And in that space of comfort, the guest will start saying things that they wouldn't otherwise have said, which is exactly what happened in this interview, right? So don't expect my interviews to be like those other interviews that you watch on mainstream platforms where the journalist is banging the drum, right? I have full respect for that form, but understand that there are myriad and multiple forms of interview, and I'm doing a very different form of interview because I trust my audience. Sometimes I'll ask a question, my guest will respond, and I'll know what they're saying is nonsense. But I'm not going to say, that's nonsense. I know that the audience will be like, that's nonsense. I don't have to agree with that. They don't need me to spoon feed them to agree or disagree with the statement. So coming back to the point about the split in the alliance, the first thing to say is that this is not the first time we have seen these kind of very serious fissures and tensions within the alliance. We've been here before, but I would say this is one of the biggest points of tension that I have seen before publicly. When have we been here before? The first time we were here, I would say, was during the Mbeki presidency, particularly in the build-up to the Polokwane conference, but I would say from about 2005 into 2007. And there, the differences were really around economic policy. The alliance was criticizing the ANC for its neoliberal policy direction, for its macroeconomic conservatism. And there was a point at which some people actually thought, and funnily enough, Bladen Zimande was one of the foremost critics at this time, that the alliance would split purely based on the economic policy trajectory. Now, what brought the alliance back together was actually the Polokwane conference in 2007, where a new policy platform led by President Jacob Zuma promised to create a more left-leaning ANC, which ultimately, I'm afraid, didn't happen, quite frankly. But the alliance was brought in, there were promises of a new economic policy trajectory, and all of those feuds subsided. We then had another massive dispute, and this was, funnily enough, during Jacob Zuma's presidency, when allegations of state capture reached their height. We saw, again, Solly Mapaila, to his credit, he has always been clear on this, accusing Jacob Zuma effectively of corruption and saying that this kind of leadership was inappropriate and calling eventually for Jacob Zuma to resign as president of the country. So the SACP became very vocal towards the end of the Zuma presidency between 2017 and 2018. And how was that resolved? That was resolved through a leadership change. Zuma left his second term, and funnily enough, the SACP backed Cyril Ramaphosa. So did COSATU. So, to be fair, for them to turn around now and pretend that suddenly Cyril Ramaphosa is the epicenter of neoliberalism, everyone knew that President Ramaphosa was going to pursue a more rightward trajectory within the ANC. But the SACP still backed him, publicly, before elections, and also in terms of his leadership of the ANC. So why am I telling you these historical stories? Because when feuds in the alliance reach this level, which they have already reached, the only way they have ever been resolved in the past is through a leadership change in the ANC. So now we sit in an interesting position because the ANC, again, has a conference coming up in 2027. So will we see the SACP and COSATU playing a key role through their members and through their position in the alliance, trying to push for a different kind of ANC leader. When I listened to Mapaila on President Ramaphosa, it became clear that Ramaphosa has lost the support of the SACP. So I'm not predicting a split in the alliance just yet. But what I am predicting is a big battle going up to 2027. And the SACP will first check the temperature to see, can they change the trajectory of the ANC? Can they find a candidate who will move away from the political cooperation with the DA and the slightly more center-right to centrist economic policies, and find a more leftist, more traditional liberation movement narrative candidate? And what will the SACP and COSATU do about that? So that's what I see happening. But in the interim, I think we're going to see a lot of battles and skirmishes breaking out. Now, if the SACP and COSATU don't get their candidate in 2027, that's when I think we might see more further and more permanent possible splits in the alliance. But because the alliance has gone through these moments before, I don't think anyone should imagine that just because they disagree publicly about the coalition arrangement, that the alliance is gone forever. But what the ANC is in is a very precarious position, because it's an alliance both with the DA and the SACP in different ways. And it has to satisfy those two in order to remain stable, because a breakaway of either one will cause severe headaches for the party and for the government. So, I think we're really entering, in conclusion, what I think are three key eras of South African politics ahead of us. Era number one is the era we are currently in. I'm going to call it Coalition 1.0. Everything is new. We've got this new coalition that we've never had. Everyone is smiling and pretending to get along. But we will see some cracks beginning to emerge, both in the opposition and in the governing coalition. A few weeks ago, we saw Floyd Shivambu leaving the EFF. Now we see the SACP coming out and publicly criticizing the ANC. I think this period is going to last until the 2026 local government election, where everyone will try to keep things together, try to keep things stable, until they see how this is shaking out with the voters. Then period number two, I would call Coalition 2.0. I think we may see shifts in the coalition, we may see some breakaways after 2026, and the new local dynamics will give rise to a different political perspective after the 2026. So that, I think, will last for about 18 months until the end of 2027. And then what happens at the end of 2027, which I will call the third period, let's call it Coalition 3.0, is when Cyril Ramaphosa leaves the ANC presidency. Of course, if he leaves before, then just apply this analysis to that moment. I think Ramaphosa, to his credit, is really one of the forces keeping this coalition together. Somehow he's managed to make friends with the DA and the PAC and IFP, and everyone, even if they don't admit it publicly, sees him as a legitimate leader. But when he leaves, it's not clear to me that the DA would stick around, various other parties. And it's not clear to me that there's any other ANC candidate who could attract the confidence of these other parties. And so I think things start to break apart then. So 3.0 is when Ramaphosa leaves and when the ANC has a new leader. And depending on who that leader is, we'll see which way the coalition winds blow. And that period will probably last until the 2029 national election. So what I would say is strap in your seatbelt. The cracks are beginning to emerge, but throughout the next 3 eras of South African politics over the next 5 years, we are going to see some of the biggest shifts and biggest changes that we have ever seen. And guess which platform will be right there to watch along with you, sympathize with your grievances, and laugh along as we're all shocked and surprised by the drama that is South Africa. SMWX. Please like, share, and subscribe. We are really close now to 150,000 subscribers. If you're listening on a podcast platform, give us a positive rating. And please, this platform grows through word of mouth, through you having conversations. Well, it also grows because now mainstream media takes our interviews and creates news stories about them, but also word of mouth. And the word of mouth is what we care most about. Talking to people about the channel, commenting below. You know, we have a vibrant comment section, which I think is better than the opinion pages of many newspapers. So contribute, be part of this SMWX community. It doesn't mean you have to agree with me, by the way. Even if you disagree, this is a political community where we share our views respectfully and we learn from each other. So I'm glad to have you on board. Thank you for watching another episode and see you on the next one. Aye.